Lila Gaines was 22, a vibrant and ambitious young woman who had grown up in the rural heartlands of Nebraska. The daughter of a mechanic and a part-time school librarian, Lila was known for her insatiable curiosity. Her childhood was filled with adventures in the open fields and countless stories her grandmother told her about the Watchers, who supposedly roamed the cornfields at night. Her family owned a modest farm on the outskirts of a small town called Clover's Hollow. Life there was quiet but challenging. Lila's father, Patrick, was a pragmatic man, rarely indulging in superstition. Her mother, Irene, however, often warned her to avoid the cornfields after sundown, claiming the crops held secrets that were better left alone. Despite these warnings, Lila had always been drawn to the cornfield. As a child, she would weave through the towering stalks, pretending to be an explorer charting unknown lands. But as she grew older, the eerie stillness of the fields at night began to unsettle her. By her 20s, Lila had moved to the city to study journalism, but frequently returned home to help her family. On one such visit in late October, she decided to dig into an old mystery that had always fascinated her: the disappearance of 3 local boys who were last seen near the cornfield in 1978. No one in Clover's Hollow liked to talk about Eugene Crowder. He was the town recluse, a former farmer who had been ostracized after his wife and son vanished under mysterious circumstances. Gene lived in a dilapidated cabin on the edge of the cornfield and was often spotted muttering to himself or staring blankly at the crops. Rumors swirled about Gene's involvement in the boys' disappearance. Some claimed he was a madman who had lost his mind after losing his family. Others believed he practiced dark rituals in the cornfield. But no evidence ever surfaced to link him to any wrongdoing. Gene rarely spoke, but when he did, it was always cryptic. "They listen," he once told a shopkeeper, gesturing towards the cornfield. "They see everything, and they don't like intruders." The Gaines cornfield stretched for 30 acres, bordered by dense woods on one side and Gene's isolated cabin on the other. The field was eerily quiet in late autumn, the dry stalks rattling like brittle bones in the wind. The time was October 28th, just days before Halloween. The air was crisp, and a heavy fog had rolled in, giving the landscape an otherworldly appearance. Lila decided to investigate the cornfield at night, armed with only a flashlight and her grandmother's old tape recorder. Her plan was to document the area and see if she could uncover anything unusual. As she stepped into the field, the world seemed to change. The rustling of the stalks felt deliberate, as though the field itself was alive. Shadows danced in her periphery, but every time she turned, there was nothing there. She began recording. "It's 11:45 p.m. The field is strange. The air feels heavy, and there's this faint sound, like whispering. I can't make out what it's saying." Suddenly, her flashlight flickered and went out. The whispering grew louder, surrounding her. It wasn't just the wind. It was voices, low and guttural, speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Panicking, Isla tried to retrace her steps, but found herself disoriented. The rows of corn seemed endless, and no matter which way she turned, she couldn't find the edge of the field. That's when she saw it. A figure standing in the distance, barely visible through the fog. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move towards her, its gait slow and deliberate. As it drew closer, Leela realized it wasn't human. Its form was twisted, its limbs unnaturally long, and its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. She stumbled backward, tripping over a root, and landed hard on the ground. The figure stopped just a few feet away and tilted its head as if studying her. Then, in a voice that sounded like a dozen people speaking at once, it said, "Leave." Before Lila could react, a powerful force swept through the field, bending the stalks and knocking her unconscious. Lila woke up at the edge of the cornfield, her tape recorder clutched tightly in her hand. It was morning, and her parents were frantically searching for her. When she played back the recording, the whispering was clear, but something else was audible. A deep, menacing growl, and the chilling word, "Leave." Lila never returned to the cornfield. She moved back to the city and began writing about paranormal encounters, but she never published the story of that night. Gene Crowder disappeared a week later, and his cabin was found abandoned, with strange symbols etched into the walls. To this day, Lila believes the cornfield is more than just a field. It's a doorway to something beyond human comprehension, a place where watchers dwell, waiting for the unwary. Would you like any changes or additions? Eli Parker was a third-generation farmer in Missouri, a man deeply rooted in tradition and the land he called home. At 47 years old, Eli was known for his quiet demeanor and strong work ethic, running a farm that had been in his family for over a century, and the Parker farm was expansive with sprawling fields of corn that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. Eli lived alone, his wife having passed away years earlier, and his son, Ben, now grown, had moved to the city. Farming was a solitary life, but Eli took pride in it. He spent his days tending to the crops and his evenings sipping coffee on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The Parker farm, however, came with its own lore. Eli's grandfather used to tell him about the Hands, a name given to mysterious figures said to appear in the cornfields after dark. According to the stories, these entities were the remnants of those who had disrespected the land, doomed to wander the fields for eternity. Eli dismissed these tales as superstitions, relics of an older generation. In the summer of 1998, the stories resurfaced in the local news after a farmhand from a neighboring property vanished without a trace. His belongings were found near the edge of a cornfield, and the only clue was a series of strange, hand-shaped impressions in the soil. By the fall of 2021, Eli had all but forgotten about the stories. It was an unusually dry season, and the harvest was behind schedule. Determined to finish before a forecasted storm, Eli decided to work late into the night, despite the old warnings about staying out of the fields after dark. The evening was unusually quiet as Eli climbed onto his combine and started the engine. The massive machine roared to life, its headlights cutting through the inky darkness. He drove into the field, the stalks bending and breaking beneath the blades. As the hours passed, a heavy fog began to roll in, shrouding the field in an otherworldly glow. The air felt dense, and Eli noticed that the usual nighttime sounds, crickets, distant coyotes, had vanished. It was as if the world had gone completely silent. Around midnight, the combine's engines sputtered and died. Frustrated, Eli climbed down to check the machinery. The fog was so thick that he could barely see a few feet ahead, and an eerie sense of unease settled over him. As he worked to fix the engine, he heard something, a faint rustling in the corn. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but the sound grew louder, more deliberate, like footsteps moving through the stalks. "Hello?" Eli called out, his voice steady but cautious. There was no response. He grabbed a flashlight from the cab of the combine and swept the beam across the field. The rows of corn swayed gently, but there was no sign of anyone. Still, the feeling of being watched was undeniable. Eli decided to call it a night and head back to the house, but when he turned to leave, the path he had taken was gone. The combine was still there, but the neatly cut rows he had driven through were now overgrown, as if they had never been touched. Panic set in as Eli realized he was lost in his own field. The corn seemed taller, denser, and the fog only made it harder to navigate. He started walking, hoping to find his way out, but the rustling followed him, growing louder and closer with each step. Then he saw them, shapes moving in the fog. They were humanoid but distorted, their limbs elongated and their movements unnatural. Their faces were obscured by the mist, but their hands were unmistakable, gnarled and claw-like, with fingers that seemed to stretch endlessly. Eli broke into a run, the flashlight bouncing wildly in his hand. The figures moved faster, closing the distance effortlessly. He tripped over a root and fell hard, the flashlight skittering away. When he looked up, one of the figures was standing over him. Its face was a void, but its hands were vivid, glowing faintly in the dark. It reached out and touched his shoulder, and a searing cold shot through Eli's body. He blacked out. Eli woke up at dawn, lying on the porch of his house. The field was perfectly normal, the rows of corn neatly cut where he had left off. His combine was parked at the edge of the field, its engine running smoothly. But something was different. Something was different. Eli felt wrong. His hands were ice cold, and no matter how much he tried to warm them, the chill wouldn't go away. He began noticing strange marks on his property, hand-shaped impressions in the dirt, the walls of his barn, even on the windows of his house. Over the next few weeks, Eli's health declined. He grew gaunt, his skin turning pale, and his hands became so cold that touching anything felt unbearable. One night, as he stared into the mirror, he saw them behind him, the hands. They reached out, and everything went black. The Parker farm was sold the following spring, but the new owners didn't stay long. They claimed the house was haunted, with handprints appearing on the walls and furniture without explanation. Eli's son Ben tried to investigate, but the locals refused to talk about what had happened. All they would say was that the Parker farm had a history, and Eli should have heeded the warnings. Some nights, when the fog rolls in, people claim they can see figures moving through the Parker cornfield, and if you stand too close, you might feel a hand on your shoulder, impossibly cold, and hear a whisper in your ear, "You're one of us now." If you're finding value in this video so far, do me a quick favor and hit that like button below. Enjoy. Rachel Fairbanks was 36 years old, a real estate agent from Ohio, known for her charm and unwavering work ethic. She lived with her husband Alan and their 2 young children, Lily and Max, in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Life for Rachel was structured and predictable, just the way she liked it. But there was one chapter of her life she rarely spoke about. The summer she spent with her uncle on his farm in 1996, a summer she had tried hard to forget. As a teenager, Rachel had been sent to stay with her uncle, Samuel Fairbanks, after her parents' divorce. Samuel lived alone on a sprawling farm in Iowa, miles from the nearest town. While he was kind-hearted, he was also deeply superstitious and avoided the southernmost part of his land, which was dominated by a massive, overgrown cornfield. Samuel warned Rachel to stay away from the field, claiming it was cursed. He told her the land had once belonged to a man named Walter Grady, who disappeared along with his entire family in 1933. The locals believed the field was tainted, and some whispered that it had a way of pulling people into its depths, never to be seen again. Rachel dismissed these tales as old farmers' lore. But as weeks turned into months, strange things began happening. Rachel often felt as though she was being watched, and she sometimes heard faint laughter coming from the direction of the cornfield, even though no one else was there. Samuel grew increasingly paranoid and burning sage around the house and placing salt lines at the doors. One fateful night in mid-July, Rachel woke to the sound of whispering outside her window. She peered into the darkness and saw a faint light flickering at the edge of the cornfield. Despite Samuel's warnings, curiosity got the better of her. She grabbed a flashlight and slipped outside, drawn to the glow. The cornfield was thick and overgrown, the stalks towering above her. As she ventured deeper, the air grew colder, and the light seemed to move further away, always just out of reach. That's when she saw it. A small clearing in the center of the field where the corn had been trampled down in a perfect circle. In the middle of the circle stood a scarecrow, but it was unlike any scarecrow Rachel had ever seen. Its frame was made of twisted branches, and its face was a burlap sack with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right at her. Hanging from its arms were dozens of tiny objects, trinkets, jewelry, even toys, all weathered and rusted with age. As Rachel stepped closer, she noticed a gold locket dangling from the scarecrow's arm. It was identical to the one her mother had lost years ago, a keepsake from her late grandmother. She reached out to touch it, but the moment her fingers brushed the metal, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. The whispering grew louder, surrounding her. The voices weren't coming from the wind. They were coming from the scarecrow. It spoke in a language she didn't understand, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Rachel turned to run, but the cornfield had changed. The rows were no longer straight, and the path she had taken was gone. Every direction looked the same, and no matter how fast she moved, she couldn't find her way out. Hours seemed to pass, though Rachel couldn't be sure. Exhausted and terrified, she collapsed to her knees in the middle of the field. That's when she felt it. A hand on her shoulder. She turned, expecting to see Samuel, but there was no one there. Instead, she found herself face to face with the scarecrow. It loomed over her, its burlap face impossibly close, and whispered a single word: "Remember." Rachel woke up the next morning at the edge of the cornfield, clutching the gold locket in her hand. Samuel found her there and immediately knew what had happened. He packed their belongings and moved them both out of the house that very day, abandoning the farm altogether. Rachel tried to move on with her life, but she could never explain what had happened in that field. Over the years, she occasionally found herself dreaming about the scarecrow, its hollow eyes staring at her and its voice echoing in her mind. Then, in 2023, Rachel's childhood home was sold, and she was contacted by the new owners. Among the belongings left behind was an old journal belonging to Samuel. In it, he had written about the scarecrow and the objects it carried, claiming they belonged to those who had disappeared in the field. He wrote that the scarecrow wasn't just a figure. It was a collector, a keeper of memories, and anyone who touched it would be bound to it forever. Rachel burned the journal, but the dreams didn't stop. Every now and then, when the wind is just right, she swears she can hear the whispering again. She has vowed never to return to the cornfield, but deep down, she knows it's not finished with her. Would you like me to expand on any section or proceed with the third story? If you haven't already, consider subscribing to our channel for more content like this. Your support helps us keep creating awesome content for you.